Cool. Well, thanks everyone for coming to our talk this evening. So what we do as part of the gallery program is we have a kind of educational aspect, and that usually is in the form of these panel discussions. And what we try and do is do a discussion not necessarily linked to specific artworks, but taking ideas maybe from the curator or from the artist and expanding upon those ideas. So in the past, we've done talks about all sorts of things like human rights, for example, was one of them. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is we're sitting in the show. It's called I, Cyborg, and it's been curated by a guy called Will Corwin. And Will had written an essay that accompanies this show. And one of the themes of the essay was Will's concerns about the trajectory of the human species into the future. So we're really honoured to be joined by this wonderful panel. We have Lenny Moss, Robert Pepperell, and David Roden. And I'm going to just ask these guys to give a very brief sort of 5-minute introduction about their background, and then we'll begin addressing some of the concerns and going on a bit of a journey and exploring some ideas about the curation of the show. So Lenny, if you'd like to just briefly tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, wonderful. I'm going to say a few things about the idea of the program. I mean, As far as background, I have a background in biology and in philosophy. I'll leave it at that. In his 1927 magnum opus, the German philosophical anthropologist Helmut Plessner declared that we humans are artificial by nature. He was following a long tradition that noticed that biologically we were under-specialized, juvenilized apes, or as Nietzsche subsequently put it, the unfinished animal. More recently, the contemporary British philosopher Andy Clark, who just happens to be talking in Russell Square tonight, has referred to us as natural-born cyborgs. 2, we are only recently becoming aware of the depth and extent of our sociality, the sense in which we began as creatures of the group, and still in no small measure continue to be creatures of the group, which is what makes possible our symbiosis with culture, including technology. As partly individuated and yet still creatures of the group, I suggest we are, in that sense, what I would call hybrid hominins. 3, I suggest we should tread carefully in invoking the concept of species. And remember that since the late 19th century, we've been socially constructing partitions amongst ourselves, disingenuously blaming nature by calling said partitions race. Racialization is something we do to each other. It's not nature doing it to us, nor technology. In the midst of Brexit and the Trump constituency, and many other divisive manifestations in the world, we should be careful to avoid temptations to sublimate present anxieties into future technological or quasi-natural determinisms. We are certainly opening powerful new doors, but what we do in the realm of what the Germans call spirit or Geist, which is to say in the realm of norms that can be made explicit. 4, finally, I suggest that we allow the artworks in the exhibit, canaries or otherwise, to elicit not only our intuitions about what we are or may be becoming, but also about what we have always been.
Thank you.
I'm an artist by background, and I began working seriously with computer technology in the mid-1980s, which seems a very long time ago now, and became increasingly involved in using computers for various kinds of creative tasks. And it was that very close work with computers, seeing their potential and their limitations, actually, that made me realize, and I wasn't alone in this, that everything was going to change, that these machines were not necessarily at that time, but certainly were going to become awesomely powerful and allow us to do things and maybe prevent us from doing things in a way that no other systems or machines had done before. So that kind of very intimate working with technology made me question what these things were, and it led me down a path which ended up in a book called The Posthuman Condition, which was first published in 1995, I think. And in that book, I tried to come to terms with the implications and consequences of what technology at that time was and seemed to promise to become. And I think much of what seemed to make sense at that point in terms of how we work with, are connected to, and interact with technology seems to still make sense now at a point where technology has evolved exponentially from then on. So my use of the term posthuman is not a dystopian one. I felt very early on that this wasn't a case of us against the robots or the AI systems, but rather, and I think it relates to what Lenny concluded actually, rather a re-evaluation of what we understand humans to be, looking over a very long time scale, so looking over hundreds of years, at the way our understanding of what a human being is has gradually, in some cases, catastrophically shifted. And my use of the term posthuman refers specifically to posthumanism, which is the period of human culture which follows what you might call the humanist period, which, depending on where you want to pin it, started either in the Greek, ancient Greek times, or probably more likely during the Renaissance and in the couple of centuries after that, where a certain view of what a human is was defined, and a certain philosophy and ontology and epistemology went with that we've largely inherited as a culture from that period, certainly in the Western tradition. And my view was that many of the assumptions that came along with that view, many very deep assumptions, had to change in the light of what we had subsequently discovered about the nature of reality. And so really my understanding of the posthuman is what is now different about what we understand about human beings compared to how humans were described or understood 300 or 400 years ago.
Yeah, like Lenny and Robert, I'm not going to say too much about myself. My background is in philosophy. My biography is pretty boring, so I'll pass by that and also talk a little about my use of the term posthuman. I wrote my book, Posthuman Life, really coming out of an engagement with, rather like Robert, ideas about technology and technological change, and questions about the extent to which, technology was in charge of us, or we were in charge of technology, and whether it was kind of leading us to some dystopian, Matrix-like world. And I became quite puzzled about I came to think that actually the term posthuman had lots of confusingly different and often vague and unhelpful uses. So, as Robert was saying, there's a perfectly respectable notion of the term posthumanism, which describes a kind of critical project. It's found a lot in the academic humanities, to sort of question the limits of our ideas, the limits to which a certain notion of the human and the autonomous human individual, for example, can provide a foundation for ideas about politics, for example, liberal thought, ideas about ethics, possessive individualism, for example, the whole notion of property rights comes out of this side of the individual. And so there's there's a perfectly coherent idea of posthumanism, which is questioning the extent to which humans are kind of isolated, self-subsistent individuals which stand over against a non-human world which they can remake in their own image. Then there's the notion of the posthuman which crops up a lot in discourse about the future, the idea that there could be, if you like, some post-human successor to humans, something like Terminator or something like the Cylons in Battlestar Galactica. I mean, it's very hard not to fall back on science fiction avatars here because, there are no post-humans of this kind currently. However, it doesn't follow that there couldn't, that such beings are metaphysically impossible. There might be posthumans, it's just there aren't any yet. Equally, arguably, the reason why we're concerned about the possibility, and why Will, the curator, is concerned with the possibility of such a post-human state, is that it's a state that we could bring about through our own technological activity. So it seems to me quite important that we, if you like, clarify that concept. And obviously, if we lean on science fiction avatars, we're going to get fairly confused, because if there are no post-humans, then selecting some particular fictional post-human like Terminator is probably not a very good guide to what actual post-humans would be like. So I've argued in my book that actually we need a very abstract conception of the post-human, one in a sense which could be realized in potentially lots of different ways. And I mean, to cut a long story short, I argue that in a sense you get to the point of a post-human state where technology goes feral, where it in a sense becomes independent of the human system. But of course there are lots of different ways in which that might occur, and also it's a non-trivial claim that it could occur, it might not. And obviously that's a very different kind of post-humanism to make that claim that there could be feral technology is very different from claiming that, you know, our idea of the human individual, the human subject, isn't up to deciding questions in ethics or politics. So I want to distinguish those two conceptions of post-human. One's metaphysical, one's critical. I think they're both worth considering, and they both, in a sense, touch on the subject of this show.
Great, thank you. So what we're sort of doing is we're going to draw out a couple of statements from the catalogue essay, and the first thing I want to talk about a little bit is artificial intelligence. One of the lines in the essay, Will writes, "This exhibition is taking place at the cusp of species differentiation. One of the disquieting and fascinating questions we've looked at centres on the idea of multiple species of the genus Homo coexisting at the same time." So he's kind of addressing this idea of artificial intelligence. And also people like Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking, of course, have made statements saying that the biggest threat to our existence is this development of artificial intelligence. Do we have any thoughts about that? Where does that sort of sit with this idea of sort of post-humanism? And is it a reasonable sort of statement as well? This is what I'd quite like to explore for a bit. So perhaps we should start with you.
With me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So one of the ideas we inherited, I think, from this humanist period, which is roughly sort of 1500 to about 1900, was the idea that the human mind is essentially a logical process. That the world is essentially a logical, rational place, and that with sufficient inquiry, the right kind of methods and tools, we will understand what's going on in our mind. So the idea, for example, of the clockwork mind, the machine mind, reached a sort of zenith in the 1950s. So the AI project of the 1950s was very much built around this idea that the brain is a logical system. It's a set of components. You could replicate the same components in another system, and you'd get the same end result. That turned out to not to work. It just fell over under the weight of its own complexity. Much actually, as well, I won't go into that. Neuroscience may do anyway, as well, for the same reason. So the AI scientists had to take a different approach, and the solution they came up with, which is one that is now spreading rapidly throughout the sciences, is this idea of the neural network, the self-learning system, which had all kinds of interesting predecessors in the 50s and 60s, but no one really took any notice of it. And things like DeepMind and the really big advances in AI, and I think I'm correct in saying this, I'm not an expert in the field, but my understanding is that these are essentially neural networks which have learnt how to do very clever things. They haven't been programmed to do them. The conditions under which they learn have been programmed, but not the learning itself. That's been done by the system. And we don't know how those solutions have been arrived at. It's essentially a black box to us, that the system has kind of evolved through its own learning processes. Now, what that points to is in the one hand, it's a huge achievement of human culture that we've been able to do that. On the other hand, it points to our limitations, what we can't know. So there's the slightly arrogant view that I think some people had in the 50s and 60s, which we can crack this with enough maths and so on. We can't. The brain and the mind does not work in that way, we are realizing. And the AI system reflects that. It's a very different kind of approach. It's a different kind of outcome to the one we might have expected. So I think for me, this is one of the features of the posthuman condition, is the recognition of our own limits and the recognition that pure logic and rationality isn't enough to get us where we would like to be.
Well, I'll say something. I mean, yes, I'm quite sympathetic to what Robert's saying. And I think much of the talk in artificial intelligence is based on a misconception. I think we're first coming out of an era of worship of what I would call informationism. And because I have a background in biology, I would be particularly attuned to its roots in history of biology and the movement of certain physicists, beginning with Niels Bohr, but then really Max Delbruck and Schrödinger, into what became molecular biology. The field of molecular biology was predicated on a kind of informationistic ontology. And I think, you know, as Robert says, that the way it's been played out in computationally oriented AI has shown to be a failure, and the way I think it's reaching its limits in biology. I think that a lot of that was seen in the Human Genome Project, for example. I mean, the kind of informational ontology led people to think, and I was still in the lab back then, that, well, of course, when we know the human genome, we'll be able to know what makes us human, and, you know, we'll have at least 80,000 genes to 200,000 genes, and so on. And anybody who disagreed with that, who thought that, well, that's, you know, we probably have 20,000 genes, 30,000, would have lost their funding. Their career would have been over. Well, now we know we don't have any greater number of genes than a microscopic flatworm, right? Around 19,000, you know, similar to C. elegans, right? So that's not the answer. I mean, the whole informational turn is wrong-headed. I mean, I think that, as I alluded to before, perhaps the most important development in 21st century science is coming out of laboratories like Michael Tomasello's evolutionary laboratory in Leipzig. That's shown very well that the native human intelligence in general, is no greater than that of an ape. Where we excel is in our social intelligence. You compare infants to apes, and the apes, you know, come out ahead, if anything. But what we can do, what pre-linguistic children can do, is get each other, is have a sense of joint intention. An infant can provide information. The pre-linguistic infant can provide information to an adult, and they are motivated to do so, independently motivated to do so, and no artificial intelligence system could do that, or no other ape could do that. So we've been looking in the wrong place. We've been turning over the wrong stones. So maybe at some point there'll be an interesting conversation to be had about artificial intelligence, but I think it's going to be based on a very different framework.
And David, do you want to expand on that? Any thoughts?
Just do my philosopher thing and add a couple more distinctions, because we need to distinguish between artificial intelligence as a generic term and special purpose artificial intelligence systems that do one thing often pretty well. Like, for example, you've got artificial intelligence systems that can find the shortest path through a telecommunication network. but they can't do much else, but they can do that damn well, and that's a really useful thing to do. So you could argue that you have an intelligent system, really, wherever something can solve an optimization problem, find the best way of doing one particular thing. But of course, those sort of systems are pretty limited. They're not going to be able to order a meal in a restaurant. Even AlphaGo, the deep neural network, which beat the European Go champion recently, couldn't order a meal in a restaurant, at least as yet, or walk upstairs, or navigate through the London Tube. So that there are special purpose systems, and even neural network systems are often trained to do one particular thing and can do it like the clappers. The goal of the stated goal of some artificial intelligence research is different. Is to find something to find something called artificial general intelligence, which would have the kind of general sort of non-domain specific intelligence that humans seem to acquire through this process of socialization and sort of social bootstrapping that Lenny just described. And of course I think it's fair to say that currently nobody knows whether that's possible or not. If it is possible, then obviously we may be faced with a situation where such technologies could devise their own aims, their own kind of forms of life independently of us. But we just don't know that. Are we going to discuss the singularity as a separate issue?
We can. I mean, you can bring it in now if you like.
I'll bring it in now because, I mean, this is kind of where I get off. Where I get on, perhaps. The singularity hypothesis, you can trace it to a paper written by a computer scientist and science fiction writer called Werner Winger back in the early 90s, is basically the claim that if you could get human equivalent artificial general intelligence of the sort I've described, then such a system would be very smart, and also if it was as smart as its makers, it would know how to make more intelligences of the same type. But if it was smarter than us or worked faster, it would be able to make even smarter general intelligences. So you get AI, and then AI plus, then AI plus makes AI double plus, and you get a kind of what Winger describes as an intelligence explosion, whereby which leaves us standing. We're suddenly confronted with godlike entities which are as far beyond us as we are, beyond rats or slugs. So what Winger describes is a kind of recursive process where you have an AI, and then you put in the AI outputs an AI plus, which outputs something even smarter, and you have one, if you like, way of getting to a kind of post-human state. And again, since we don't know whether artificial general intelligence is possible, we don't know whether a singularity is possible, or whether a singularity would inevitably lead, whether the creation of AGI would inevitably lead to a singularity. But I think conceptually or philosophically it's important, because I think it gets at one way in which something that we made might become radically independent and radically alien to us. It may not be metaphysically possible, it may not be technologically possible, but it's at least a coherent hypothesis. And I guess my position on the post-human is to abstract from that and say, well, that's one way of realizing the post-human. It might not be technologically feasible, but there might be others. And my formula for describing the post-human, which I call the disconnection thesis, this idea of feral technology, is meant to encapsulate lots of potential post-human states, some of which may be possible, some of which aren't. I mean, some of them, like post-human angels probably aren't possible because our universe isn't magic. Perhaps something like Skynet seems a bit more plausible than sort of an artificial Sauron from Lord of the Rings. But, that's all pretty hand-wavy. So we have an abstract conception of the post-human, if you like, which could potentially be multiply realized, but we don't know which of the realizers, if any, are the actual ones that could be out there in our future.
So I mean, I think doing some research about this subject, what seems quite apparent is a generalized pessimism about the future and a sort of walking into this apocalyptic kind of future. And I'm wondering whether this concept of a post-human era is necessarily a sort of new one, or whether you guys think that perhaps there's evidence in our history that this impending doom is not necessarily a new concept. Lenny, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's certainly not a new concept. I mean, there was a zeitgeist of pessimism in the late 19th century. And it turned out for good reason. It led to some pretty nasty things happening in the 20th century. But I do worry that this, I don't know if I should call it an obsession or a distraction. I think that I worry about it being somewhat of a bit of a neurotic distraction. I mean, I think we have real problems in the real world. I think disparities of wealth and climate change and continued kind of racializations and invidious groupings of people is the source of the anxiety, not, in fact, the impending occurrence of a new post-human, whatever that means. I mean, so, what I've been arguing for is that we need to understand what it means to be human, that we've gotten that wrong. And, to the extent that we have a post-human discourse, the best it could do is to inspire us to realize that we have been natural-born cyborgs all along, or artificial by nature. In other words, we're born, some people would say, the orphans of nature. We don't have instincts. We don't have pre-given specializations to different attunements of nature. Everything has to be learned. So in that sense, is artificial. We've been using technology going back over 1 million years to, the Acheulean hand axe of Homo erectus. We've been involved with companion species. I don't know how long, longer than we could provide ourselves with evidence for, but pre-Homo sapien, no doubt. Right? So it seems to me much of what we're talking about in terms of post-human is a recovery, in some sense, of the plasticity, the openness, the dependence that we've always been, and in some sense we've tried to ignore. And just a thing on the singularity, I'm going to tweak that a little bit. I mean, what I've noticed, and I have to confess to watching, way too much sort of B-type TV series and things like that. But I get tired at night and I watch junk. What can I have? But what I've noticed is that one TV series after another, one movie after another, it's all grappling with the possibility of an artificial system, a robot, what have you, developing feelings, developing intersubjectivity, being able to do mind reading, all the stuff that, in fact, is what makes us distinctive, and I think it's telling. I mean, so there was one show with Halle Berry. Now, Halle Berry is one of the reasons I watched it, I admit, but that was the main theme. They had an adopted son. Her husband was a computer engineer, and he developed feelings. I mean, he was originally a robot, but he made that transition. I mean, I think that as far as mass culture is concerned, that's the real singularity. That's the real critical transition, and we see it in shows. I asked my students to name a few in class, and they surprised me because I assumed that they were just born a couple of days ago, and they came up with things like Blade Runner and Terminator 2, and I forgot about those. Right? Those are a long time ago. I should remember them. But that's true. So it's actually not new, but it seems to me it's an extremely recurrent theme, and the reason for it is exactly because we don't have a story to tell as to why our operating system, given a little bit more information, a little bit computational prowess, can't become our girlfriend, as Spike Jonze played around with in the movie Her. right? We don't have that story to tell, and I think that we have to go back to appreciating that it actually is the wetware. We can't ignore the wetware. It's not all about abstract algorithms and so on. And so we're sort of spinning our wheels with that conundrum.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how near Andy Clark is, so I don't know if he's in earshot. But I think that, I mean, I really like Andy Clark's work, but I think there's one argument he comes up with in the book, Natural Born Cyborgs, which doesn't work very well. And his argument is, well, suppose if we are natural born cyborgs, we've always been incorporating stuff into our various mental routines, like using abacuses or using nobody remembers a telephone number anymore. I take it we have our mobile phones for that. So we've always used devices for getting around the world and for understanding it and for, even doing long division on a piece of paper. We're using stuff out there to do something mental, to do something cognitive. So I take that on board. We've always, in a sense, we are natural-born cyborgs. We incorporate stuff into our mental routines. And Clark says somewhere in Natural-Born Cyborgs, well, the fact that we shouldn't be scared of a sort of weird post-human world because we've always been creatures who incorporate stuff into our minds, and we're still human. But of course, that's not a very good argument, because the fact that so far we've always done this without becoming inhuman doesn't mean that we or some offshoot of us might not become inhuman at some point in the future. So I don't think, so it's just a bad. I think it's just a bad inductive argument. It just doesn't follow that because we've always, we haven't stopped being human in the past, that and of course we need to be careful about the use of the plural, the first person plural here, might not become something different in the future. It just doesn't follow that we won't. So I don't think we should see our cyborgian sort of status as a source of comfort or as an argument against the sort of speculative conception of the post-human. As to whether becoming post-human in that speculative sense, that is, becoming inhuman, might be a good or bad thing. Well, I think we just don't know that until we're there, since we don't know what that state of being would be like.
Could I just ask you a question? I mean, but what you're saying requires that we have criteria, at least rough and ready criteria, if not necessary and sufficient conditions for what counts as a human. I mean, how do we know when we're not human anymore? We've always been changing, and incorporating different technologies has been part of that, but not the be-all and end-all of it. So what's the criteria for being human or not being human?
That's a difficult one, I'll concede, because it's not clear that there's some kind of essential property of humanness that. I mean, if there was an essential property of humanness, like something, I don't know, having an immortal soul that's necessary or sufficient for being human, then my job would be easy, because you'd have a post-human where, if using some kind of technology made us lose our soul, you'd be automatically post-human in the sense I'd be describing. But that's not, that seems pretty implausible, and there probably isn't such a sort of essential criterion. So I'm inclined to view humans more as a sort of coherent population, more in population terms, as a particular kind of biological population, which is also connected to a certain exterior, if you like, technological, social, institutional envelope, because we are also dependent on our cultural systems as well, on our social systems. So to that extent, I think I'm with you. So I want to distinguish between a narrow, kind of more or less biological conception of the human and a wide conception of the human, which incorporates anything that we depend on and which reciprocally depends on us. Like, my toothbrush is, in a sense, human in the sense that it wouldn't exist other than as part of a kind of human socio-technical network. If my toothbrush was able to replicate itself independently of human technological mediation, then we'd have something like a post-human toothbrush. But currently and luckily it isn't. It's not that smart.
I think I disagree with you in the sense that I think we are driven. One of the characteristics of a post-human understanding is we're driven to the realization or conclusion that the technology is us. That any attempt to draw a distinction or barrier between some kind of wet end and a material mechanical end it will end in failure, because there's nothing that all this stuff is part of our. It always has been, as Lenny said, as long as we've known humans have existed. One of their features has been, and it's not only humans who do this, but they use devices and tools and so on as part of their everyday activity. It's one of the things that makes humans unique and distinct is the extent to which they do that. So go back to the point about the dystopian or the pessimism. If the technology is us, albeit writ larger and written in an extended way, then it reflects and projects. It's what we are. If humans have a dark side, they have an evil and a sinister side. It's not inhuman to behave in evil ways. I don't think animals have evil. That's an interesting ethical question. And there's a positive, beneficial side to human nature, which we also project through and into our technologically extended domain. I would even go far, and then this is one of the main arguments in the book, that it goes to say there isn't really any distinction between ourselves and the world at all. Wherever you look for a boundary between, and you might think it's the skin, but it's not, because there's all kinds of ways skin interacts with the world and mediates our existence within the world. There's no, and science actually tells us this. If you look at a molecular level, a subatomic level, certainly at the biological level, we are absolutely integrated into the world, and it's nonsensical actually to demarcate any individual biological being anyway, but certainly humans as a set of unique bodies which are independently floating around in the world. So I think once we've come to terms with that, and it's not easy to come to terms with that, it knocks away some of the kind of underpinnings of our epistemology and so on. But once we do come to terms with it, it makes a lot more sense to think about technology as both a positive and a negative projection of our historical human condition.
Well, I don't think I preclude wet post-humans. I don't think anything in my, simply, because my account's so annoyingly abstract, it really can embrace. It doesn't imply that post-humans have to be kind of clunky devices or shiny metal.
The question is what constitutes a human. And in the toothbrush example, is that constitutive of the human condition?
I'm not sure that there is anything constitutive of the human in the sense of some kind of essence. So, I think it's better to think of the human in the wide sense as a bit like a lump, just a very complex lump involving biological parts like us, cultural, institutional, technological parts. Even domesticated animals are kind of wide human insofar as their continued existence depends on us until they kind of go feral. So feral pigs, they're not post-human or post-pig, but they're existing outside the human system in a way that pigs on a farm aren't. So you can I think you can make a meaningful distinction here. It's obviously problematic. I mean, you can go back to the sort of history of philosophy and say, well, instead of talking about humans, we can talk about moral persons. So a moral person is a being able to determine, able to act out of reasons. So it's able to act according to certain principles that it adopts because they're good or judges them to be good or bad principles. So it's essentially a kind of Kantian idea of the person. And that's not necessarily species-specific. Mr. Spock might count as a moral person, or a Cylon might, in Battlestar Galactica might. So that might be one kind of way we want to demarcate the human, but there might be post-humans which are very interesting and complex agents, but not persons in that sense. They may not subscribe to social norms in the way that we do, because they may not be social.
Yeah.
Seems to be an entirely coherent, metaphysical possibility. Whether it's a technological one, again, I don't know. But of course, if that is a possibility, then the post-human is also, outside any kind of human moral framework as we understand it.
So, one of the things I noticed in looking at the exhibit, some of the smaller pieces, lots of colors, upstairs by one of the two people named Roxy. I don't know how they found two artists named Roxy. I've never met anybody named Roxy. But is that some of the pieces looked like, reminded me of Cousin It in the Addams Family. Maybe that's because we're approaching Halloween. But and what that brought to mind was that what we're opening up, a window that we're opening up, it seems to me, with biotechnology, is realizing the possibility for new forms of life. And I wonder if that wouldn't be a more salutary term than talking about species or post-human, but a multiplicity of forms of life, which we're party to, that are permeable to each other, and so not carrying along the kind of hard partition legacy of speciesism and racialism and so on. And but what the opening up of new forms of life, and of course, I mean, just within the the spectrum of the existing human community without genetic intervention, we have lots of different forms of life with different different life worlds and normative frameworks and so on. But it seems to me that the real challenge, I think, that we should feel called upon to address in opening windows onto new possible forms of life with technology is a normative challenge, is the challenge of being able to address normative issues associated with forms of life that we're party to and that we're responsible for and so on. And I think that also lends itself to the other side of what the curator was talking about, which is a return to utopian and emancipatory notions. I mean, it hit me not that long ago that hey, what happened? Back in the 60s and 70s, we were talking about technology relieving us of unnecessary labor, of post-scarcity anarchism.
When did the future stop becoming a promise and becoming a threat?
Exactly, that's right. And so that's where I have to wonder whether it isn't socio-political realities that we've taken on board too uncritically, that sort of gotten under our skin and under our psyche, that's leading us to imagine technology is doing this to us, or the future is dark. Well, no, the present is problematic in lots of ways, but in ways that we are normatively party to and responsible for, and have to address. And I think it would be all the better to consider the opening up of new possibilities as part of an emancipatory program, and not something that is all doom and gloom.
At this point, I'd like to sort of open up to you guys. We've been covering a myriad of different sort of subjects. I'd be interested to know if anyone out there has any questions for the panel.
Yeah, I do. Can I jump in first?
Of course you can. Yeah.
My name's Steve Duncan. I'm a sculptor, and I work with a kind of interface between plants and human identities. I was just interested to hear floating around between all four of you the two terms post-human and post-humanism. And I understood humanism as it originates during the Renaissance as being an attempt to define a world of human civilization and morality without religion. Are we now looking at so that religion is abandoned in a new definition of what it is to be human? Are we now looking at the term post-human or post-humanism as, in a sense, an abandoning of morality?
Abandoning of what, sorry?
Of morality.
Morality.
Certainly post-God, perhaps, rational...
well, that's already been achieved by humanism, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there are there are non-theistic humanists. I mean, Sartre, for example, Jean-Paul Sartre, is arguably a humanist. In his book, Existentialism and Humanism, he's interested in the idea of living in a godless universe because it implies that we have no essence. We're unlike a paper knife has a function that we define. If there's no God, there's nothing out there to define what we must be. We are free to determine, we're fatally free to determine our own nature. But, arguably a humanist discourse is any which gives us some kind of privileged place in kind of determining the foundations of value, and it's not clear that it has to be non-theistic. There are, some Renaissance humanists were also theists, but they also argue that humans had a special kind of place in creation and a special relationship to God. So I'm not sure if I'd want to equate humanism and irreligion. I mean, even Kant, who's arguably a great humanist philosopher in many ways, wasn't an atheist in the traditional sense. So I think, I want to distinguish.
Was there a more specific sort of question? Sorry.
I think you're onto something. I think especially in the case of the transhumanists and the new sort of flat ontologists, that it's precisely because their whole way of approaching their thinking, their philosophy, and so on, is normatively vacuous. They have no normative resources that it leads towards the idea that yes, well, posthumanism is amoral. And again, I can't help but wonder whether this is a kind of sublimated expression of feelings of political impotence, that elites and terrorists and so on are doing things that they're not in a conversation with us. We can't hold them morally accountable to their actions. And I think I also see it in things like, maybe you'll think this is ridiculous, but a kind of iconization of the high-functioning autistic who struggles to have intersubjective connection and to base ethical judgments on intuition. I mean, it seems to me there's something indicative, if you will, about the way Sherlock Holmes has been portrayed over the years. I'm an old fan of Sherlock Holmes, from the sort of classic English gentleman of Basil Rathbone to the high-functioning autistic of Benedict Cumberbatch, right, who plays a certain kind of amoral, technocratic character very well. I love the way he does it, I must admit. But it seems to me it reflects something in the zeitgeist where we are struggling with the possibility of an end of a kind of morality.
Well, I would take posthumanism to be a more useful concept than the posthuman for the reasons that you gave. And the simplified version of the story is that prior to the humanist epoch, gods or the entities beyond transcendental entities were in control of nature and human destiny. And one of the features of the humanist period was the idea that humans wrested back that control. They defined their own conditions. They were responsible for their own history and their own future. And Marxism is probably the kind of one of the most vivid outcomes of that way of thinking. And that had a downside, actually. The downside there was that it was a certain kind of human. It was the white European who was the predominant. Because, of course, this was a period of slavery as well, and a period followed by rampant destruction of the earth through exploitation of its resources. So, and under that moral system, anything that served the human was acceptable and perhaps good. And I think what's, maybe not morally, but ethically, what's come out of my understanding of the posthuman is that because we can no longer hold on to any distinction between ourselves and the world, or between ourselves and each other, we're all intimately and deeply connected to one another and to the environment that we are part of each other and part of, then that has an enormous ethical impact on us. We can no longer think of people on the other side of the world as resources. We can no longer think of the planet as a resource, because it is us. We are it. We can't. That's not an option to think about it in that way. So I think there is a and I think actually reflected in some of the work here. I think in the Aziz and Kutcher piece, that's an image of us grappling the conflict or the crisis that we are in politically and socially once we abuse and misuse our environment and each other. And I think it was much easier in a previous era to get away with that kind of behavior. It's not acceptable anymore, increasingly.
Hey, my name is Nimrod, I'm a journalist. Post-humans is really easy to define. It's any group of humans that move to a different planet and live there for more than a generation or two, or any group of humans that just left for a different star system and lived on a spaceship for like a few generations. There would be post-humans, different gravity, different oxygen levels in a spaceship.
Yeah, that might be one way of making a post-human. Might be one recipe. I'm kind of, yeah, I'm cool with that.
We solved it.
Yeah, well, it's one way. I don't think it's a definition of the post-human. It's one kind of possible instance, perhaps. Yeah.
Well, it would be a different form of life, but we do have lots of different forms of life. I mean, we shouldn't underestimate, the amount of diversity that we have on the planet, right? I mean, there are people who still live largely in arboreal habitats and feel uncomfortable outside of a forest. I mean, they're disappearing, sadly, but we shouldn't underestimate the vast diversity we have. Of course, not having gravity would result in interesting changes in a different form of life. But I think, as you would want to say, whether we would recognize them as human is an empirical question. I mean, I'm not convinced that we would have any more trouble recognizing them as human as we would, some isolated tribe in the Amazon or what have you, with very different practices. But
yeah, it might depend on lots of practical factors, just like how easy it is to interact with these people, or these creatures, how well their body shape kind of fitted into the kind of environments we used to inhabiting, so there might be all sorts of quite subtle things that divided us. It's not necessarily kind of radical metaphysical distinctions, but quite just, could we sit at a table with them?
Yeah.
If they're evolved for zero gravity or very low gravity, we might not be able to. In that case.
the sort of also the discussion about the post-human is partly about our relationship. I mean, this sort of topic began because we were talking about our relationship to technology and stuff, but also recently scientists we've moved into a new epoch in the planet called the Anthropocene, which is about the planet's history and evolution. From 1950, scientists are now saying we've entered into this new epoch, and it's directly related to human beings' relationship to nature and its effect on the planet and stuff too. So this sort of we're going off in some interesting directions with like this idea of a post-human thing, but the concept itself actually feels like quite a relevant sort of cultural kind of question that affects people, I think.
Hi, I'm Victoria. I'm interested in the visual culture surrounding the discussion we're having, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on how much you think our projection of the future informs the actual occurrence of what the future is. Because obviously, because our vision of what something can be is what then we can model things on, and therefore what our vision of that future is can propagate what that future is that takes place. So, for example, like lots of things look like Blade Runner, but how many people watched Blade Runner and then modeled things on it? Or, for example, Stanley Kubrick, I think he spent lots of time with NASA before creating 2001: Space Odyssey. So when you have these kind of visions of what the future may be, whether they're utopian or pessimistic, often depends on the person who is creating that vision of the future and their outlook on life. So therefore you get that really very human element in actually how it pans out. And so I wanted to just get your thoughts on whether or not we are just kind of, creating our own future in that way.
Yeah, I mean, like with a lot of sci-fi, if you look back on the day the Earth stood still, for example, it was about trying to describe what it was really about was about the bomb, the atomic bomb, you know. So with sort of theoretical visions of the future, I think really like what Lenny was saying, a lot of that is about reflecting what's really going on around us in the present, perhaps.
Exactly.
Don't know, what you've got any more thoughts about this?
Certainly when you look back at historical attempts to envision the future, one of the things that they tend to always get wrong is how much stuff stays the same. So there tends to be this idea that everything, the whole fabric of our culture and society will all change. And you should walk around London and you're walking through buildings, past buildings that were built 300, 400, 500 years ago. Not much has actually changed. Probably not much has changed in terms of our behaviors and so on. So I think it is important to recognize the way in which there's a kind of continuity. However, having said that, there are lots of examples of I think there's some people who study this, the ways in which imagined futures end up determining or influencing greatly the actual future. And any moment in time is always going to be a dialogue between them. You know, we're going to be looking backwards and forwards all the time, and so those are always going to be deeply integrated and probably too integrated to disentangle.
I mean, before we came down, the three of us were involved in quite a rigorous discussion, and you know, at some point I thought they're probably taping us, and this is what's real. But part of our discussion meandered to talk about the philosopher Heidegger, who's a terrible character in lots of ways, but also probably the most important figure relevant to the kind of discussion that we're having for a number of reasons. And just one point from Heidegger relevant to your question. I mean, he had a certain understanding of the role of what he called the work of art. And for Heidegger, the role of the work of art was to, in his jargon, to set up a world. But I mean, the way of understanding that was that when art works, as he would say, it's seizing up from the margins of contemporary interpretive possibilities a new vision of how we can be, of how things can be. It's, in Heidegger talk, disclosing a new world. And it sounds to me that that's exactly what, you know, I'm sorry that it's Heidegger we have to give credit to, given what a, you know, piece of work he was, but it seems to me that that's probably the right thing to say, that we need a new vision, a new disclosure for what to do with our technology. By the way, famously, but hopefully not so famous that you've all heard it already, because that would be boring. You know, the last thing he's quoted as saying, I mean, he became very pessimistic precisely because of his sort of doom and gloom view of what he called the being of technology, and all of us becoming sort of, you know, servants of the means-ends relationship. That the last thing he said was that only a God can save us, and the secular interpretation of which is that, in effect, only a new vision of being, only a new world disclosure could save us. And you know, there might be something to say about that. So we shouldn't underestimate the significance of the work of art.
I'll just chip in quickly. The science fiction writer Cory Doctorow has a nice idea which he calls the principle of insufficient weirdness. That, you know, when science fiction writers are trying to anticipate the future, the bad ones always forget the ways in which any technology could be creatively abused in all sorts of unexpected ways. I mean, I'm for some reason, I'm just recalling an episode of The Wire, actually, when these sort of these kind of drug gangs in, is it Baltimore? I can't remember which city.
It was Baltimore. I'm the American.
Whatever.
Yeah,
start using hospital pages because the phone, you know, the mobile phone system is being hacked by the police. You know, so they just use a technology that was originally devised for one domain in a completely different way. Or you know, the use of a mobile phone as a bomb detonator, for example. So technology, you know, or at least the components of a technology are always multiple use and always be kind of used in some sort of crazy ways that, you know, no, you know, utopian fiction is likely to realised. And I mean, this is maybe a rather big segue, but I'm just thinking of Will Corwin's reading of this work by Saad Qureshi, and I've just forgotten the title. Oh yeah, And Then Came the Prophecy, which, as I understand it, is a kind of virtual landscape pieced together from bits of other landscapes,
right,
and sort of painted onto a piece of wood. And I think Will, the curator, reads this as in some way anticipating a time when, you know, there'd be no special places, that everything would become a kind of vestige of everything else, a kind of flat postmodern continuum in which there's no kind of sacredness, there's nothing special. And yet, I'm sort of wondering about that. In a sense, this does create a sense of the numinous and the special, even though it is also a series of vestiges. And also, it also reminds us that this is a material thing. It's not a dematerialized computational object. It's a physical thing. We can see the grains of wood through the image. So the materiality of the thing is existing along with the virtuality of the image that we're being presented with, which arguably is salutary because, you know, we're so used to thinking of the digital as somehow existing in a sort of disembodied domain, or the cloud, when in fact, you know, everything in the cloud is reposing on some server which probably uses as much energy as a small town to keep it running. You know, this stuff is, you know, as a recent book by Ben Bratton points out, you know, computation is geopolitical. It's actually, you know, this stuff's generating significant amounts of heat. It's a contributor to global warming. You know, so the virtual is not sort of abstract and platonic. It's instantiated, and I think, in a sense, all this is being explored in this work. It's kind of, you know, materializing the virtual as much as kind of pointing to some sort of flat postmodernist dystopia.
Hi, my name is Milo. I think you mentioned something really interesting, that it's in the meantime when we are speculating about the future of humanity, we are also trying to figure out what is being human. We are not 100% sure yet what is that, because there are a lot of layers of this. And we're aware that one of the ways that we conceptualize things is related with the knowledge we have, how we communicate and how we relate with this knowledge. For example, a couple of generations ago, it was not that easy to digest for example, in terms of gender, there would be the possibility to like switch from one gender to other, or like even though that we understand as humans, female, male, could be the possibility to be in between or in a transition. So will be like that an approach for posthuman, trying to understand that we are limited by certain times, moments of time, our self-awareness that what we are, probably we will be like going to a expanding time of our idea of human, or like contracting these ideas. I don't know if it's...
Well, I don't know if I caught everything, but the one thing that came to mind in what you're saying that maybe would be useful is the realization that human is a normative concept, not a descriptive concept. Right? And I think that's one of the things we've been confused about. Right? In other words, as you say, there was a time when you know, you had to be either this or that. That's a normative dicta, not a scientific objectivating one, and we get those confused. But it seems to me precisely because being human is a normative issue, first of all, that I think it's not necessarily helpful to talk about posthuman. I think it's more important to understand that it is a normative concept to begin with that doesn't have specific essential determinants, and that it's our responsibility. And this is a kind of humanism, I'm sorry. This is absolutely a kind of humanism, to say that it's our responsibility as normative beings to stand up for our normative claims, to be responsible for our normative claims. We are responsible for making ourselves. That is what it means to be human, and if that's humanism, shoot me, arrest me.
Any further points? Any questions?
No, I just disagree with something. No, you just said that artwork, back to you, that artwork was our image of the future, but what about the past when we look at history documented in art? I mean...
Did you? I didn't quite.
Well, I think there's the point that springs to my mind here.
You were talking about Heidegger and the role of the art object.
Right, and you think I'm neglecting the past? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I just don't believe it's just a way of predicting the future. I mean, like, if it was...
No, what I would say, I mean, what I would say in the Heideggerian vein is that when we disclose a new understanding of who we are, we're also reinterpreting the past in a certain way, right? That the past can't dictate the future. The past is in some sense part of our ongoing present and part of how we are interpreting ourselves. So we shouldn't be constrained by it. We shouldn't dismiss it either, right? I mean, if we interpret our future, if we disclose a new possibility that can't incorporate the past in an adequate way, then there's a problem with that new disclosure. Right? So we do have to respect the past and be accountable to the past, but not predetermined by it.
One last question.
Yeah, I just want to come back to something you said about the fear of the future.
Yeah.
I mean, can we expand a bit on that? Because
Sure.
it seems like a really interesting sort of issue that at one point we speculate about the future post-war, the 60s, as being a very positive development of our society, our culture, our notion of what it is to be human, and also just that sense of what one can make of the world. Are we now in a position of actually being very frightened of what is possible? Post-human?
I guess it depends on your individual perspective, but there are...
Well, you said it. You did introduce that.
Yeah, so there are a couple of sort of things that do point to this idea that there's... that man's kind of existence on the planet has already irrevocably sort of changed the environment that we're in around us. So there's this idea that following that trajectory through to its logical conclusion in the future, the world is getting more polluted, more overpopulated, less of a sort of hopeful place. And I mean, I guess whether or not that anxiety is, like Lenny was saying, whether or not that anxiety is based on some sort of logical trajectory, or whether we're just merely reflecting a collective sort of anxiety that could be linked to stuff like our communication media, the fact that we can read the news on our phones, the fact that we're a lot more connected and so can therefore share, I don't know, I guess, negative things that are going on around us. I don't know, it's like maybe that reflects what's sort of happening in the world in other aspects that generates a kind of pessimistic sort of a view of the future. Or not, I don't know. But I think there are certain sort of things that do point to and kind of back up this idea that people can feel rather frightened of the future, and sort of confused.
George, can I just add to that? I just wondered whether anybody agreed that, dystopianism is a product of the media, essentially. That, if it weren't for the fear-mongering in the films and science fiction through the years, that we might have a slightly brighter vision of the future, because it doesn't have to be dystopian, really.
Well, I mean, that's a difficult one to answer, isn't it? Because it's like this intractable thing. Like, what is the media doing? Is it feeding us what we want? Are we telling it what we want to hear? Or is there a sort of, pyramid scheme which is feeding information down and controlling us. And I mean, that's like a whole nother sort of panel discussion, basically.
I suppose we take a kind of morbid delight as well in sort of cultivating fictional utopias. I mean, they're much more fun than fictional dystopias, because they're just more fun than utopias.
Yeah,
there's more dramatic meat to be had, imagining, the evil galactic empire than the kind of beneficent one.
It could be argued that that's what
capes,
sells, really. But
you get capes
it could also
and
be argued
masks.
that, if that wasn't all we were fed, we would have a slightly brighter vision.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fair point, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I like Lenny's sort of vision of sort of the multiplicity of forms of life, and it's kind of what I think. There is, but I think that multiplicity need not be understood in anthropocentric terms. It need not resemble us. It need not be like us. But it doesn't mean, in a sense, that it might not have, some kind of value or moral status of its own that we could discover or acquire, even in certain scenarios. So I think that there can be if not a utopian posthumanism and an affirmative posthumanism.
Well, we've covered a lot of different ground. I just want to thank you guys for coming, and thank you for contributing, being here, being part of it, and. I guess we'll see you on the next. See you at the next talk. Yeah. Thanks for coming.